Hello, welcome to Tomb of the Topstones. This is the second installment in a continuing video series exploring the world of Topstone masks. Previously, we looked at the history of the shock monster, the most influential Topstone mask, certainly the one best known today. But in the 1950s and 60s, the Caveman and Gorilla were the real mascots of the Topstone brand. The Caveman and Gorilla are the classic comedy duo of the Topstone universe. They are the Abbott and Costello, the Laurel and Hardy, the Martin and Lewis of Halloween masks. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s, it was hard not to run into this pair of primates. The Caveman and Gorilla were often advertised side by side in mail order ads in comic books and magazines. They were staples of magic stores and joke shops. And of course, during the Halloween season, you could find them in every drugstore and five and dime. The Caveman and Gorilla were used extensively in film and television. They appeared in a number of movies, from low-budget horror movies to the original Pink Panther. They popped up in sitcoms like The Honeymooners, The Dick Van Dyke Show, The Andy Griffith Show, and many others. Anytime a script called for a rubber monster mask, the costume department would use a Topstone. They were the go-to monster masks of television's golden age. One of the most beloved examples of this was Slam Bang Theater, a regional television show popular throughout the 1960s, produced in Fort Worth, Texas. Slam Bang Theater was hosted by a slapstick character named Icky Twerp, played by local TV personality Bill Camfield. Icky was accompanied by two simian sidekicks, Ajax and Delphinium, who performed skits wearing Topstone Caveman and Gorilla masks. The act became a Texas sensation and still retains a cult following to this day. Ajax and Delphinium were similar to another slapstick television act, the Nairobi Trio, a sketch created by comedy legend Ernie Kovacs in the 1950s. The Nairobi Trio were three gorilla characters who attempted to play well-known pieces of music, a kind of ape-faced Three Stooges. Mask collectors tend to think of the Nairobi Trio as a part of Topstone history, but in fact, Kovacs did not use Topstone masks in this act. The Nairobi Trio probably used generic masks made in West Germany, or Kovacs could have had the masks specially made for the show. In any case, they were not Topstone masks, and they were not sculpted by Keith Ward. As we learned in the Shock Monster video, Topstone was a Connecticut-based company founded in 1946. It was owned and operated by Keith Ward, a famous illustrator well known for children's books and commercial art. Throughout the 1950s, Keith Ward sculpted all of the iconic Topstone characters, including the Caveman and the Gorilla. No one has been able to pin down exactly when the Caveman and the Gorilla and the rest of that classic assortment of characters were first introduced. They appear in catalogs as early as 1956. They were probably introduced much earlier than that. In 1950, Keith Ward registered trademarks for all of the Topstone characters that he was producing at that time. The Caveman and Gorilla were not included in those trademarks, nor were the Shock Monster or the Cyclops or the Ghoul or the Female Vampire or any of the iconic lineup of Topstone characters. The earliest trademarks for Topstone's classic lineup dates to 1961, even though the company had been producing those masks for several years at that point. It's worth noting that Topstone was undergoing a reorganization in 1961. Keith Ward sold Topstone to a company called Bland and Bland, and it's likely that the reorganization had something to do with his decision to register those trademarks in 1961. Now let's look at some masks. These are modern reproductions of the Keith Ward Caveman and Gorilla. These are modern pulls from molds made from the original urethane rubber masters. These modern pulls were made by VXX Effects, an independent mask maker. Because they are cast much more thick than the originals, you can really see the detail of Keith Ward's sculpts, much more so than you can in a vintage production example. In the early 2000s, there was a find of original Topstone masters. All of the modern, thick Topstone pulls on the collector's market owe their existence to that find. Independent mask makers have taken those original masters and used them to make new pulls, and that has made Topstone masks much more available to modern collectors. Without them, it would be very difficult to collect Topstone masks because the originals tend to be very rare. But rare or not, here we have two original Topstone masks. These are vintage production examples of the Keith Ward Caveman and Gorilla. These are the actual masks made by Topstone that you would have found in a store or that you would have gotten if you ordered them out of Famous Monsters magazine or a comic book. You can see that they look just like the illustrations. A lot of people joke that Topstone masks look so different from the illustrations that the illustrations oversold the masks, and what you actually got if you ordered them was very different. But I don't think that's the case at all. The sculpts for these masks look exactly like the illustrations. Later in the company's history, the rubber got thinner and the paint got sloppier, and the masks that Topstone was putting out did not do justice to Keith Ward's original sculpts. But these two are early versions from Topstone's golden era. If you ordered these masks out of a comic book or a Famous Monsters ad in the 50s or 60s, you're looking at what you would have received in the mail. These masks are what you would have got. Here we have two Topstone gorillas. They look different, but they are the same sculpt. They are from two different eras, but it's the same original Keith Ward sculpt. I don't know which one is the earlier of the two. I suspect the darker one is earlier, but I'm not sure. I do know that the one in the Pink Panther is exactly like the one on the right. I don't know what source material Keith Ward drew upon when he was sculpting the gorilla. It doesn't look like a real gorilla. The most obvious inspiration would be King Kong, but it doesn't really look like Willis O'Brien's King Kong. It somewhat reminds me of old Hollywood gorillas, like the ones played by Charles Gamora or Crash Corrigan. It's kind of like those gorillas, but not really that similar. Perhaps Keith Ward simply used his imagination. But if he did draw inspiration from something, I think it was probably pulp art. His gorilla does look somewhat like the gorillas you find on the covers of pulp novels, pulp comic books, pulp posters. It harkens to an era before people really knew what a natural gorilla looked like. It is, as many of the advertisements said, a gorilla monster. Not a gorilla like you find at the zoo, but a gorilla monster. I think the Caveman is one of Keith Ward's greatest creations. I'm impressed by how natural and realistic it looks. Think about other depictions of cavemen that you've seen, especially in old books and old movies. They tend to be monstrous and haggard and exaggerated, but the Topstone caveman looks very realistic. It has a toned-down, naturalistic look, like a display in a museum or an illustration in a history book. The trademark registration for the caveman identifies it as a Neanderthal, and it does resemble some early illustrations of Neanderthals. I think the Topstone caveman was very influential in the way people envisioned Neanderthals over the next 20 years. Look at the Aurora Neanderthal model kit, or the Ben Cooper rubber caveman, or the Ben Cooper caveman Halloween costume. All of them owe some debt to Keith Ward's caveman design. This is the original urethane rubber master for the Topstone Gorilla. This is the positive master that would have been used to make the plaster negative molds at the Topstone factory. I've been told by people who worked closely with Keith Ward that he made these urethane masters himself. So based on the information I have, what you're looking at here is an original work of art created by Keith Ward's own hand. This is one of the original Topstone factory masters discovered about 15 years ago by a collector named George Ligori in Connecticut. The masters have since been dispersed throughout the collecting community. I was able to acquire this Gorilla master from a collector on the West Coast. Unfortunately, I do not have the Caveman master. Maybe someday. Topstone made plastic Vacuform versions of most of their iconic mask characters. Here we have the Vacuform versions of the Caveman and the Gorilla. You can see that the plastic versions use the exact same sculpt as the rubber versions. Much like the modern pulls, like the ones made by VXX Effects, these plastic versions really show off the detail in Keith Ward's sculpts. This is also a Keith Ward plastic Topstone caveman. Obviously, it's not the same sculpt as the iconic caveman, but it is a Keith Ward sculpt, and it is a caveman, and it is made by Topstone. In addition to the larger, more classic-looking Vacuform mask, Topstone made a series of these smaller masks with different sculpts. These are the 80s resculpted versions of the Topstone Caveman and Gorilla. They are recognizable as the classic characters, but they are not the original Keith Ward sculpts. In the late 70s or early 80s, Topstone resculpted their classic line of masks. The new versions look very similar to the originals, but obviously they are not exactly the same. Here we see the 80s Gorilla with its original tag. Most of the 80s Topstone masks were sold with tags like this one. Topstone made a number of other Gorilla masks besides the original Keith Ward Gorilla monster. This is probably the earliest of the other Topstone Gorillas. Collectors call this the monkey monster, though I don't think Topstone ever used that name. It looks like this mask probably was sculpted by Keith Ward. I don't know when it was made. I haven't found a Topstone catalog that pictures this particular gorilla mask. At some point, it could have been considered a replacement for the earlier Keith Ward version. In this shot, you see both a vintage original production example and a modern pull made from the master for this gorilla. The vintage example still has its original tag, though you can't see it in this shot, and the tag is from the 1970s. There are vintage photographs of people wearing this mask, which date it to the 1960s or 1970s. A lot of companies tried to copy the Topstone style. These masks are bootlegs made in West Germany. There was a thriving mask-making industry in West Germany. West German companies made a variety of masks, and some of them are quite good. but many of them have a cheesy bootleg quality, like these two. That doesn't make them bad, in fact, they're kind of charming in that way. Even a mainstream company like Ben Cooper was not above ripping off Topstone's designs. This is a Ben Cooper caveman mask, and you can see it's obviously inspired by the Keith Ward Topstone caveman. Besides masks, Topstone also made an entire line of rubber hands and feet. These are the original masters for the Topstone Gorilla hands. Like the Gorilla mask, the hands were also sold in comic book ads. Topstone made a number of other monster hands, including scarred hands, skeleton hands, even an octopus hand. This is a vintage example of the Gorilla hands, mint in their original bag. You can tell by the header card that this is an early example, probably from the 1960s. Topstone tended to sell their hands and feet in bags like this with header cards. This is a later version of the Topstone Gorilla hands. You can see that these are longer, they go almost to the elbow. Based on the tag, these are probably from the late 70s or early 80s. Topstone made a number of full-body gorilla costumes. Most of these costumes were generic, but Topstone also made a licensed King Kong costume. The box is really beautiful on this King Kong costume, licensed through RKO. The artwork is obviously based on the RKO poster art. The mask in the center of this image is the mask that came with the King Kong costume. You can see it doesn't really look like King Kong, but it's a pretty good gorilla mask. The masks to the right and left of King Kong are just generic 80s and 90s Topstone gorilla masks. This is a late era Topstone gorilla, probably from the 90s. And these are two really cool clamshell packaged gorilla masks. In the 80s and 90s, Topstone sold a lot of masks in these plastic clamshell packages. The mask on the left lights up. Topstone made a whole series of light-up masks. While Topstone made a lot of gorillas, they only made a few other cavemen. This is an example of a generic 80s caveman that has no relation to the Keith Ward version. Collectors have debated whether this is actually a caveman or a werewolf or Mr. Hyde. I think it's a caveman. And this is a master for yet another caveman. I think this might have been sculpted by Keith Ward. It has his style. It's very similar to the earlier caveman, but it's updated. The hair has a more sculpted look. Whereas the earlier caveman was sold with glued on fabric hair, this version of the caveman was only sold with painted hair. I think we've traveled deep enough into this cave. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to this channel so you'll be sure not to miss future installments of The Tomb of the Topstones.